Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Odd Man Front, a Sumer Sports podcast. I'm your host, Parker Fleming, and I'm here every Thursday afternoon talking a little bit NFL, talking a little bit of data, and all around just having a good time. Got another really cool interview today. Another guest gonna talk about the league a little bit, some more recent stuff, less been talking to people about research and all that. We'll get to talk about some games. That will be a lot of fun. Before I bring him on and introduce him, make sure you're subscribed to the Sumer Sports channel. You get all on the same channel. You get Thomas Dimitroff and Eric Eager, Dr. Eric Eager, every Monday and Wednesday talking about the games. Yesterday, they had a really interesting discussion about quarterback metrics and offensive line metrics, and a whole lot of fun there. A lot of knowledge on that podcast. And on Tuesdays, my colleague Sean Syed and Tej Seth are doing a little bit of a stats and scheme, kind of more in-depth review of the week as well. So a lot of fun on that channel. You get me on Thursday as well. And then sometimes on Friday, Eric hops on and does an immaculate grid or something interesting there for your drive home on Friday afternoon. So make sure you're subscribed to all of those things because you get them all right there in the Sumer Sports podcast. That is enough rambling. I'm going to go ahead and bring on my guest. You know him. He's been on the podcast before. Kevin Cole, Unexpected Points, Substack, internet's football poster guy, all around research for football. Kevin, how's it going, man?
Good. Yeah, internet poster guy. It's always a little bit of an awkward introduction at all the different dinner parties that I go to, of course. But yeah, that's how I classify myself. And I have to ask you. I was going to ask you off camera about this. It's very Matt Patricia. The pencil behind the ear here. Is he your inspiration?
No, he stole my look, man. That's probably not true. He's definitely older than me, but I definitely have just always kind of done it and committed to it. So it's nice to have it right there. Although the heck of it is, I got one of these like paper tablet things that's like an e-tablet. And so now really I don't even use pencils anymore because I really use the stylus, but I'm not going to put the stylus behind my ear. So
I don't think he uses the pencil either. He just has it there to, I don't know for what
just
purpose,
in case.
But maybe it reminds people of the fact that he's what is he, like a rocket scientist or something like that? So he's got that as part of it too, probably.
Yeah, just the subtle nod to like, I don't have to do math right now, but I could if I needed to.
Right, exactly. You never know. You never know when the situation may arise. So he's prepared at all times. I respect him for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, yeah, Kevin, thanks for coming on. I know we talked and did a little bit more of an interview of kind of, how'd you get to where you are in sports analytics and what are you working on now? Big picture stuff kind of this off season. So if people want to hear about that, I think that's still, that still applies today and is still good material. So go back. That's in the Sumer Sports feed. You can get that first interview with Kevin. But I wanted to have you on today because you do a couple things on a recurring basis that I think are just super interesting, a really good way to cut out some noise and look at the league. And so I wanted to bring you on and talk about those a little bit. Of course, your Substack, Unexpected Points. I'm a paying member. I think it's worth it. Absolutely. For anyone listening, just some good data and commentary on the league in general. Would you, Kevin, just kind of lay out, if people are unfamiliar, what on Unexpected Points, what are you kind of doing regularly over there?
Yeah, I mean, during the season, there are a few kind of like you mentioned, regular pieces that are coming out. I have what I call advanced game reviews, which looks at a bunch of different metrics from the games that I'll just lay out for people to be able to see and kind of peruse on their own, quarterback metrics, and then also trying to adjust for some of the more high variance, less sticky type of aspects of play and come up with an adjusted score, which I probably should be pumping that a little bit more this season because it tends to get people upset, which will then get it shared. So maybe I have to do that a little bit more often. But yeah, it'll basically just tell you fundamentally, this is how I look at how the team's played. And it's mostly based upon like success rate versus some of these outlier plays. Turnovers, sure, they matter, obviously, but they're not going to be super sticky, especially fumble recoveries and things like that from week to week. And then special teams play, third down conversions, things like that have just a massive effect on a smaller sample, where people may not quite be able to appreciate the fact that, like, for instance, the Jaguars have been awful converting third and fourth down so far this year. Will that continue? I mean, it could, of course, but I don't think there's anything fundamental about that offense where we would expect that. So that would be, for instance, an aspect that makes them look a little bit better by the numbers than what their final scores have been.
Yeah, and so many of those are so interesting. That adjusted score, I think, is a really fun concept. I know a couple people have kind of come out with something like that.
Yeah, they've stolen it from me. Thieves. That's good. I'm not a fan of the like. There's like everyone's stealing my stuff type. You know that comes out a lot. Like there'll be very intuitive sorts of things, and then people will say like, "Hey, I had that first." It's like, dude, that was the most intuitive thing ever. We're not like stealing the in the vault or the secret formula for Coke. But as you mentioned, yeah, I think it was Timo Risque over at PFF has something which he calls noise canceled something scores, maybe.
Yeah, noise cancel score. I think is what he's calling it.
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
probably
which
some
is
other stuff.
cool.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Which is an adjacent concept to, like I play around with the dumb little Eccles stat and thinking about like, hey, drive opportunity and how much value did you create on that or whatever. And it's kind of adjacent. And all those anyway, good, good ways to kind of cut through and just at least test assumptions. Say, hey, if this number is way different from the final outcome, what do what can you take away from this game? I do like a net success rate for college football games and just compare that to like, hey, how was the score? What was the final score and what was the net success rate? Because a lot of times that can identify where shenanigans did occur and what might not be kind of predictive week over week there. You do, in addition to the downweighted or not weighted, the adjusted scores, you also do an adjusted quarterback efficiency. And so can you tell me a little bit about that? And then I want to talk about specifics of quarterbacks and how they're doing so far.
Yeah. So I have a couple of different things that I'm doing. I've done this adjusted quarterback efficiency. I came out with it last year where I kind of started the Substack, I don't know, 2/3 of the way through the season. So we had a pretty good sample on it. It tried to really like isolate down to the quarterback. And some of the metrics that I was using in there, one is this ESPN has what they call an open score that they give to different receivers based upon the tracking data. So that's not quite available yet. I've been pestering Seth Walder and others over at ESPN about when that'll be available. So I haven't done that yet. But what I've done for my adjustments so far this season, and I just came out with the first one this week, is really not focus on the schematic or maybe the things that are going to continue on for the rest of the season, but really try to look at the high variance stuff, which probably has some stickiness based upon the quarterback when it comes to, how many interceptions they have versus their interception worthy throws or drop rate or things like that. Like there's probably some element of quarterback in there, even if we try to say it's 100% Lux business. But I'm looking at it just isolating for those things and then making adjustments based upon it. And it has a pretty big effect for some different quarterbacks out there, especially when we're only talking about 3 weeks of data so far in the season. It will start to, average out, and everyone will start to regress back out as the season continues. But I think now there have been some results so far this season where people may be higher or lower on particular quarterbacks, not just based upon quarterback wins, but also what the results have been, which kind of feeds into the scoring and the wins, which may not be a proper representation of how good they've been this year.
Yeah, and quarterback wins. Obviously, it simplifies a whole lot there, but it does kind of drive public sentiment. So looking at your graph, and again, I don't want to put all this out here because I do think it's good work, and I want to direct people to the Substack and pay for it.
You can put it out there. It's fine.
No, looking at
I put
some
it
of
out
these,
there, so it's okay.
Okay. Looking at some of these, you see some tiers here, and you break it up by. Kind of who has the biggest adjustments, who has kind of some small adjustments. And we see a couple that are really, really interesting. So like Tua Tagovailoa has kind of been the best quarterback so far, just in terms of overall efficiency. And obviously they're just putting up absurd numbers over and over and again. But he still gets a pretty big negative luck adjustment and is still far outpacing everyone. So if I'm looking at his performance going forward, what does that big adjustment and the fact that he's still kind of outpacing everyone tell me about his what I should expect from him the rest of the season?
Well, I think what it was kind of telling us initially is that he wasn't going to maintain, even if there was no luck involved in this sort of explicit manner. I think I would bet against anyone after 3 weeks of the season maintaining what would be the best efficiency ever in the history of the NFL. So that's number one. We could probably assume that was going to happen. But the second thing is, and I think this is when I get into arguments, and this would be mostly arguments you're getting into fans and other people on this, is that, like, for instance, if I were to say Tom Brady has been lucky in his career to have these different aspects, or Bill Belichick has been lucky in their career to have this. I mean, people who are near the top when we're looking at results. So people are near the top in results. If we all agree that results are a combination of skill and luck, then people that are near the top of the results probably are more skillful, and they're probably getting more luck than most people. That's how they end up at the top, and then vice versa. So what I would say about Tua is, although he's adjusted down for luck that he's had this year. Primarily luck he's had with fewer drops than you would have expected, a pretty weak strength of schedule so far this season, and playing in decent weather conditions versus some others. His drop isn't as big as we've seen for Brock Purdy and Jordan Love, who were 2 and 3 in your unadjusted number going into the season. So yeah, a lot of the top guys get moved down, and Tua still has a pretty healthy lead on the adjusted QB efficiency, who comes in second, and that's Patrick Mahomes right here, who really doesn't move that much because he's been so negatively affected by, the drops that we witnessed primarily in week 1 against the Lions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense there. And looking at this, I mean, some people might say that the harder you work or the better you are, the luckier that you do get.
You make your own luck. Yeah, sure.
Exactly. It does seem that there are kind of types, even if there's not, necessarily like homoscedasticity and moving, the variance is changing with quality there of what luck is. But you see kind of the guys who have broad range of outcomes. Your Mahomes, Tua is up there, Jordan Love and Brock Purdy, both, big adjustments, but towards the top of efficiency. And then you've kind of got this really interesting cluster that basically goes from like Mayfield to, I don't know, Stroud, I think is probably where I'd see this looking at this graph of these guys who almost feel like they just are who they are. Like, even if you adjust for luck and you're just saying, hey, consistently, this is kind of how they're playing, we know what we're going to get. It's interesting to me that you've got, kind of disaster at the tails, for negatively, and then really boom or bust kind of at the top. But then this really, really kind of concentrated, just these guys are who they are there in the middle.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, is positionally where they are. Like I said, you're just more likely to have a positive adjustment up if you're at the bottom, and then vice versa if you're at the top. So if you're at the middle, you're probably just more likely than not to have a smaller adjustment. But the reality is, like, if you just were to pick out the guys who have the biggest adjustments in either direction, you're still going to be left. And I have 34 different quarterbacks here. Anyone who has 50 dropbacks so far this year, we've had some backups step in there like Minshew and others who have gotten above that threshold. If you were just going to pick out, let's see how many guys here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe like 8 to 10, 8 to 12. The rest of them barely have any adjustment in it. So I think that's important. I think, like, generally when you're looking at something like EPA per play, and people like to dismiss these certain things, so they can point out, oh, well, it didn't capture this and it didn't capture this. And if it says that, Brock Purdy is better than Patrick Mahomes, then it's the worst stat ever on the history of the earth. Okay, well, some of these guys have adjustments, but I think generally it does a pretty good job. It's just whether or not in some of these outlier cases where it can make a big difference. And that's when it really affects the perception versus reality gap for certain quarterbacks. Like, Jordan Love and Brock Purdy have the two biggest adjustments down so far this year. And I think it's not just their efficiency, but even when it comes to something like luck on a team basis, I mean, if the Saints make that field goal, we're probably feeling different about Jordan Love and the Packers going into this week, despite the fact that they literally did nothing to get that result and to make that field goal get pushed wide at the end of that game.
Yeah, and kind of separating out from, how did we get to that situation at the end is probably more informative than the result of that situation at the end. Yeah, I know we're going to spend a little bit more time on quarterbacks because I want to talk about your Bayesian ratings too. But I do want to ask with luck, have you found that there are certain elements of things, that were drops, for instance, with Tua that are related to that might be related to style that are a little bit harder to capture, and that there might be some kind of stickiness to those lucky elements as well? I think about drops, for instance, depth of target gets really, really long. That's gonna put a lot more onus on. You're gonna get a lot more drop passes just because you're, more vertical down the field.
Yeah, no, there's definitely something to that. I mean, I look at not specific exact tracking data, field location, but I do look at the more general buckets that they have in the charting data that I use from FTN, and then also the data that comes out of NFL Faster, which is pulled out of the NFL's play-by-play feed, where they look at, center, right, left, deep, middle, short, behind the line of scrimmage, air yards that comes into it. What's interesting is you mentioned that for the long passes, and my intuition was that was the case for the long passes, but it's actually like these short passes over the middle that end up having a lot of drops. And that was also that's something that came up because I remember I first investigated that when the the Steelers were dropping a ton of balls with Ben Roethlisberger. In particular, Deontay Johnson was a guy who was dropping a lot of balls. And there is an element of that, of like not just the quarterback and how he throws the ball may be part of it. Obviously we're talking about a lot of edge cases here in a small sample of drops, so we don't really know. But I do think there's also like a field location element if you're throwing all of your passes over the middle of the field, because I think that the receiver just doesn't see them as quickly. They have there's a lot of traffic around them, which probably causes them to lose concentration, and the ball gets on them very quickly. That if you just have a passing game that looks a little bit differently in that regard, that you can end up having more drops. But I try to adjust for that as best I can in these numbers.
Yeah, and some of that is, I mean, you could always go down the rabbit hole of selection and say, how much more can I adjust this to say, maybe it is the case that an average quarterback throwing deeper would get more drops, but also the average quarterback's not going to throw as deep as often, and so there's some of that there. I think this does a good job.
Not going to throw deep to guys who can't catch the ball, also. Guys who can't track the ball. So yeah.
And so there is some revealed preference and average depth of target there, and potentially those adjustments. Let's talk a little bit of Bayes before we get into kind of the week and talk about some games. So in addition to the luck adjusted, you do have a Bayesian quarterback rating that is going to take in some prior information, update a little slower, and try to give us an idea of what to expect going forward for these quarterbacks. I think the internet would say it's a good metric because we have Patrick Mahomes at the top right now, and we have Zach Wilson at the bottom. And insofar as we need a smell test to validate a rating, that's about as good a smell test as possible. What are kind of the components of this, and what do you think the value it adds over the luck adjusted rating?
Sure. Yeah. I found this because there's been a way of doing kind of a Bayesian projection where it's more of a binary outcome, and that's been a way of looking at it. I've used it for things like making or missing field goals and having different adjustments, but I didn't realize you could use this kind of normal distribution and also do something similar. And I don't know what I was doing. I mean, I'm not a PhD, so I'm gonna out myself here as a non-PhD. So just everyone knows that listening to you and Dr. Eager over there at Sumer Sports. But so I do things where I just hack together things. And one of the things is I looked at one of these online, classes, and they did this thing about the normal distribution, the normal, function, all this stuff. And I was like, this is actually pretty interesting. So I looked at then how does the distribution of quarterbacks as far as their efficiency over their career kind of looks normal-ish sort of distribution. How about on a play-by-play basis, the efficiency that they have? And it's a little bit skewed. It's a little bit skewed as far as in the topping a little, but it's similar to a normal distribution. So I said, you know what, let me try to apply this by having the metrics for like a standard deviation and a mean for what you expect for a quarterback over their career, having that information for what they do on a play-by-play basis. And what you could essentially do is you have a prior estimate, and I start with their draft position for where they're going to end up. And then every piece of evidence that comes in, knowing how much variance there is in each piece of evidence, you can update it a little bit, and it'll slide a little bit in each direction. And as the bigger sample you get, it'll also narrow the range of outcomes. Obviously, we know a lot more, let's say, about Russell Wilson and who he is over the course of his career. He's probably not the worst quarterback in the NFL. He's probably not the best quarterback in the NFL than we necessarily know about CJ Stroud as he's just starting off here. I mean, there's some chance, maybe not a great chance, but there's some chance he's the best or the worst quarterback in the NFL at this point in time. So it tries to represent all of that in a metric that not only gives you a mean outcome, but a distribution of outcomes. And it's also like taking into account their sample history, becoming more and more confident. So if you have one really great game or one really poor game, or even a half a season of good or great games, it's going to adjust. It's going to be somewhere between where you expected at the beginning and what the results have been, but it's not going to fully move in one direction as another, which I think is important when so many people, based upon recency bias, can really flip their assumptions about different quarterbacks just based upon a handful of games. Yeah.
And it seems to take into account that kind of, there is some slowness. We don't need to overreact. That being said, you do have some big changes for a couple of quarterbacks. Some of them, there's some shuffling. Herbert, Burrow, Prescott, and Tua kind of moving back and forth. But then you've got Stroud, for instance, moved 6 points, six spots in the rating. Yeah. And so moved up there. And then you've got Sam Howell, moving 7. Both of those guys, similar, obviously Howell has a little bit more time in the league there, but both of those we don't have a lot of information. Those big changes, is that kind of saying that's more uncertainty about their performance relative to the draft position, or is that saying, as I get more information, I'm going to discount their draft position more and count what's on the field a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. You're definitely going to count more on the field than what it is for draft position, but they're also quarterbacks who don't have a lot of evidence. So in this weird way, the model is designed to not overreact to what has happened, but at the same point in time, going from 0 throws to 20 throws is going to have a bigger impact on their rating than it is for Aaron Rodgers having an additional 20 pass attempts this year, and how it's going to affect our opinion of him. It doesn't want to overact, but it wants to react more so when we're getting a higher proportion of our evidence than we would be for these other quarterbacks. Another thing I'll mention about this, and this is probably the case that people don't appreciate enough when it comes to all sorts of rankings, when it even comes to what we were talking about earlier about the luck-based adjustments, is it really does kind of follow this normal distribution a lot, where not only when you get to the outliers in both directions, the gaps start to widen. So the difference between the first team and the fifth team in their strength, or the first quarterback and the fifth quarterback in your assumed efficiency, is going to be much more than when you're going from 10 to 15 or 15 to 20 or 20 to 25. So sometimes smaller moves can have big adjustments for these guys in the middle, where on an absolute basis, it's actually not moving around that much. But I'd say generally, even for rookies, I think we probably err on the side of, at least I err on the side of reacting more quickly than some people think, because a lot of people will say as much as like a whole rookie season, oh, well, that was their rookie year. There's a billion excuses we can make for someone. Let's just forget the fact that they were awful and see what they did next year, which, sometimes they improve, but more often than not, they don't. And we have to recognize that.
I am going to just disregard all of that and ask you the question I wanted to ask, Kevin,
Okay,
because this is a small change, and this definitely has to do with like sample sizes, and is not actually like, it's one of those that you're talking about where there are small moves. But the spiciest move on your leaderboard this week, Brock Purdy up 3 spots, Jimmy G down 2 spots, Purdy now ahead of Jimmy G there. So obviously that one is probably going to be small magnitudes as Purdy continues to play very consistently in the Shanahan offense. And an interesting comparison, because of course Jimmy G moves out of it. Quarterbacks that have moved or changed systems, do you feel like you make it, or not? Do you make an adjustment for what you expected out of Jimmy G and what you would expect him to be in a new system out of the Shanahan system?
Yeah, I do make an adjustment now. The thing is, and this comes also when you're looking at like free agency or something of that nature, where if you model no matter the position, even a quarterback or not, or any position, and you just label everyone as the season in which they change teams, and you say, let's look at their whatever metric you want to look at, grading, efficiency. I have this like plus minus calculation that I use for players to estimate how much they're worth. And I say, okay, let's look at what they did last year. Let's look at what they did the year before. Let's project them into the next year. If you add a variable where you say, whether they change teams or not, and just do like a simple, let's say, linear regression on it, that variable, that factor is going to be negative. Always. It's always going to be negative no matter what the position is, and including quarterback, because there is like the selection bias of the team. Teams can always bring back a player if they want to bring back a player, no matter what the contract is or anything else. They can figure it out. It's not that, the cap is fake or whatever. It's just the contracts are very malleable for the players and for other players. So there is something embedded in that. And there's probably like an outperformance in the past that isn't going to go in the future. So I do a small adjustment, but I don't use the full amount that would have been based upon historic results, because again, like I'm saying, it is a biased selection of quarterbacks and guys who move from one place to another. The quote unquote journeymen are going to be doing it more often than others. So you're going to find guys who are probably falling off and probably just weren't as strong as they were before.
Makes a lot of sense. While we've got Jimmy G and Brock Purdy kind of compared here, and very interesting that Purdy has continued with that high efficiency that we saw of Jimmy G. How do you feel like quarterback metrics, even basic stuff on EPA, even some of the luck stuff might kind of come up short in capturing a guy who just plays well in a system like your Purdy, like your Jimmy G, that can kind of function there.
Yeah, I mean the PFF grading is probably something that I like to use in conjunction with these numbers. I think it also errs in certain ways. It doesn't have as much specificity to the like play as to what the play level is, what the grade is. I think it's something like 60% of plays are just graded as 0 on a scale of -2 to +2. And very few plays are graded lower than -1 or higher than 1. So, I think it makes sense again over a large sample, like trying to gradation. Is this a 0.25 or is this a 0.5? They only go by 0.5 increments. So maybe it's good that they don't do that. But then again, a well-executed screen pass, a well-executed pass to the middle of the field where the guy might be open, but maybe you hit them in stride. It's just not going to register enough to give them benefit for that sort of play, but it is meaningful. And I think it's something where we view Brock Purdy or Garoppolo with a quick release, getting the ball out to Deebo Samuel, who then goes and does something. We could say, well, anyone can do that. But I don't know if anyone could do that. I mean, I've seen Justin Fields throw some screen passes that weren't so hot. I've seen they had a Trey Lance there and his little windup and everything else. I'm not quite sure if he could do that. So I try to be somewhere in between, but I guess the important point is that no matter what stat we're looking at, and this is what people seem to really hammer EPA or others, and they say, well, that's a team stat. I mean, everything is a team stat. You think like passing touchdowns is not a team stat? Yeah, sure. The quarterback threw it, but then the receiver caught it. The offensive line blocked for it. Everything essentially is a team stat, maybe outside of grading. But even then, I just think grading is extremely difficult to get on a small sample, at least, who the quarterbacks are. And if you're going to compare like the year-end grading versus the year-end EPA per play, or even during the middle of the season, I think most of the time the latter ends up looking a bit better as far as like our intuition for who the good quarterbacks are. And the MVP is almost always the quarterback who leads the league in EPA per play at the end of the season. So I think it is capturing something that we're getting from the eye test.
Right. And obviously from like a causality standpoint, the quarterback, being in that system and being able to play, we think the fact that they are able to put up those numbers, even if it is a system, is still, there is some signal there.
Well, I got another take in that regard too. I feel like a lot of the social media, media commentators on quarterback play who may have played quarterback themselves at some point in time, they probably are the quarterbacks who are like, oh, I can make that Brock Purdy throw, because they're definitely not the quarterbacks who can make like the Patrick Mahomes throw or the Josh Allen throw or something like that. So they understand like juicing results out of a lack of talent, but that doesn't mean that on the NFL level, it's not valuable. So I think they might even like downweight that even more, because it's like, oh, I can make that throw. But it's like, yeah, well, you are the type of quarterback where you have to be able to make that throw because you didn't have the other stuff to make up for it. But that's not always the case at the NFL level.
Yeah, and the difference of style, and just what you're able to do. Again, there's a huge underlying kind of selection deal with what you can make happen versus what you have to resort to get the ball to those guys in the right situation. Kevin, you also have a power ranking you update weekly, just kind of a team aggregate ranking. Again, leaderboard test. You've got Kansas City and Buffalo at the top. You've got Arizona at the bottom. So smells pretty good directionally here. Who are a couple teams in 2023 that have so far surprised you? Maybe they've moved in your power ratings one way or the other, and just haven't looked like you thought they would.
I would say that the Dolphins have been surprising, but at the same time, I'll pat myself on. You got to take the opportunity to pat yourself on the back here. That I did have the Dolphins at 4th in the rankings last week and had them, in the top 10 coming into the season, and have been relatively high on them. At the same point in time, kind of mixed into my ranking is an idea of about these different range of outcomes. And they're certainly on the high side. It was like one of those things where you said, okay, in a low sample, first year in the new system with Tyreek Hill, Tua was and that offense was basically the second best offense in the NFL when he played after the Kansas City Chiefs last year. So you knew that was possible. And now we're starting to think like, oh, maybe that's more than possible. Maybe that's starting to skew as a likely outcome that they're going to end up being at least in the top 5, if not really being that high. So their strength and their, like, as far as a jump from like this team has a higher chance than most people think to make the playoffs to this team has a real chance of going to the Super Bowl, they would probably be the number one team for me that has jumped in that regard.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, no matter what kind of adjustment you do, they're going to be inflated by just putting up absurd numbers over the course of a game and not really taking the foot off the gas. But the proof of concept that they can, the proof of concept that they can do that is a signal in itself. What about a couple teams that last year kind of got by on, maybe some easier schedule, maybe some one-score wins? You have the Vikings and the Giants, both down there about 19 and 20. Or 18 and 20 power rated overall. Not a huge movement for either of them. I wouldn't imagine, just because you expected regression after what we saw last year.
Yeah, in fact, for the Vikings, it's one of those weird situations. What I would say, they've surprised me a bit on the positive side, like as far as how their fundamental play has been, which again, this is very disconnected from results. And I also think there's this concept of like, we're seeing regression in the Vikings from what their performance is this year. I mean, we're seeing a lot more than regression. Like regression would be they would play like the slightly below average team that they were, and they would have slightly below average results. Instead, we're actually getting a team that's better. I had them ranked lower going into the season. So they moved up in my rankings overall over the course of the last 3 games. Fundamentally, I feel like they've been better. If you look at the gap in something simple like yards per play, they're on the positive side. We're on the negative side last year. Kirk Cousins' efficiency is up despite the fact that he's had some fumbles that have been bad. And the team in general, 7 fumbles, 7 lost fumbles versus 18 fumbles and 8 lost fumbles last year. It's just been massively negative for them so far this year. So I think on a fundamental basis, like if I didn't include my priors from last year, the Vikings might look like a top 10-ish sort of team for how they've been playing so far this year. It's just the luck hasn't been on their side. So that's, I know you mentioned the 1-score game thing, but I think that's important to look at for these teams, is just how different the results can be from how they've played underlying. And, the Viking season could be almost over-ish. We're talking about trading away Kirk Cousins. I don't think any of that stuff's going to happen. But they've had a real bad run of luck. I would say they've been more unlucky than any team so far this year.
Interesting. And again, love having the metrics to be able to compare that and put numbers on it. All right. Before I want to ask you about Thursday Night Football and 1 or 2 games this weekend. But before we do that, I'm going to pose a question to you entirely on the spot. The bottom 5 in your power ratings are Arizona, Houston, Indianapolis, Chicago, and Carolina. I'm going to throw Carolina out because they're kind of a level above those 4 teams. Of those 4 teams, taking into account that tanking is very real, who do you expect to have the biggest positive move by the end of the season out of those 4? Out of Chicago, Indianapolis, Texas, or Houston, and Arizona?
That's a good question. I would guess the Texans. I don't know. I mean, am I already buying into CJ Stroud looking decent? Okay, first of all, if you're going to pick any of those teams, I don't think the Cardinals really have an incentive to bring back Kyler. So if you want to say that, then you could. You have to pick the quarterbacks who you don't know anything about and hope to get a coin flip of one of those 2 situations. That one of those 2 teams is going to get a positive outcome. The quarterback that you weren't necessarily expecting. And I think I'm much higher on that possibility than getting a Justin Fields, week 4 and on turnaround, unless he just starts, busting off 65-yard scrambles every week. But even then, that didn't really help them win a lot of games last season. So I'll say Texans. I'll say Texans, and I don't know why, but I'll just say Texans over Colts.
It's a fun answer, and they've been a little bit surprising this season. But yeah, it's a weird thing to say, but like the uncertainty at quarterback is the good virtue for those bad teams, because you think, hey, it might be able to get better there. Tonight, Kevin, Detroit and Green Bay. Detroit's a second, I think, Thursday night game. Did they play the Chiefs? Is Thursday night, right?
Yeah, it was Thursday night. Yeah.
So they're getting a couple here early on. Obviously, you have Detroit, rated a lot higher. What I'm interested in is kind of your take on the quarterback battle here between Love has been interesting and been pretty okay, and then obviously looking at Goff, what the kind of consistency they're getting out of him from Detroit has to be nice there. Who do you give the quarterback edge to here tonight in this matchup?
I mean, I give the edge to Goff. What you make of Goff, I'm kind of as uncertain as anyone. I think my general outlook is to say, let's trust the results in addition to what the perception is of this quarterback. And he's been pretty good. I mean, even last year, he was pretty much top 10 ish. He was actually adjusted up by some of the metrics that I had of adjusting last year. He's looked really good so far this year. He has some bad interceptions sometimes, but he had that really long streak of not throwing an interception too, which I don't think he gets enough credit for. And he's another guy who makes the throws that he needs to make, where I think we discount that as being something that is valuable when it is something that he can do. So I think he's got a pretty big lead. And again, Jordan Love is someone by the unadjusted numbers who looks really, really strong this year, but I think he's had some luck in his favor. He's got a lot of value off of defensive pass interference, which, by their very nature are either underthrown or contested catch type of situations that you're getting a lot of value out of. So I'm still a bit more skeptical on him just because we don't have the sample size also on him to say someone with he also has a pretty low completion percentage versus expectation. I think it might be one of the lowest when you look at the next gen stats. And that's something that might give you a little bit of signal for another way of measuring quarterback play is delivering the ball to the receiver is pretty important. And he hasn't been good at that so far. So that's another signal well, let's wait and see. He has been good rushing though. So that's been a positive that he's using that on almost a weekly basis to juice some extra value. So I do think that helps raise the floor for him quite a bit.
Let's talk about the early Sunday game, Atlanta and Jacksonville. Jacksonville's a team that I'm really interested in. You have them power rated just right smack dab in the middle, 15th overall. And they've had a weird season, I think, to start there with, fine win against the Colts in the division, got the win there. A loss against Kansas City where you'd like to see them do more offensively, but then a loss to Houston where things just kind of went wrong and things felt off generally. How do you expect a bounce back? Are you concerned about Jacksonville's offense with kind of some of these performances here at the beginning of the season? How much can we just write this off as early season weirdness and they're going to get back on the right track?
I would say they've been unlucky and they also have not been that good. That's how I would describe how they've been so far this year. Yeah, you mentioned that I have them right in the middle of the league, and then going into the season, I had them at 14th. So I probably wasn't as high as some other commentators were on them. Primarily, my assumption is people are saying, and they do this a lot with rookie quarterbacks, where it's maybe a little bit more relevant with rookie quarterbacks, but still, generally, you always take the bigger sample over the split sample. As they said, well, look how good they were in the second half of the year. Now project that forward into this year, and boom, you're competing for the AFC Championship game or something like that. And we just can't ignore the first half of last year where all these weird, quirky things were happening, things weren't clicking, and we've seen, I think, some of that bleed through into this season. So I think. I wasn't very high on the Falcons either, mostly because of a skepticism about Desmond Ridder. So I don't think that. I think this is a matchup that they should be able to win, and maybe I'd even favor them a little bit versus how the market's favoring them right now. But I would say for Jacksonville, they've been okay. They've been okay, and they performed even worse though, so they have been unlucky.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, like we talked about a little bit earlier, you make your own luck a little bit, and so if you're underperforming, that's going to leave you open to some more.
The third down stuff though is pretty important. Let me just pull it up real quickly because I got it in front of me here just to see how much worse they've been than the rest of the league. And this can continue though for a whole season. I mean, Carson Wentz made his entire 2017 MVP campaign on outperforming on third down because he was just basically average before that. Yeah, if you look at just in this season, they're already down 36 expected points versus what you would have expected on third and fourth downs so far this year. They've converted 12 where you would have expected about 19 different conversions in these situations. So that's a big deal so far in just a few weeks of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I have, I've got them at 25th and third and fourth down success. And I give you, you get credit if you try twice and you get it. Yeah. You get credit for that there on that number. So 40%, 25th on offense. But then their average third down distance is really small.
Yeah.
5.93. And what I love about that is like, I love these stats that are kind of misleading because you're like, yeah, it's a bad thing to have a short average third down distance because that means you kind of suck on first and second downs and you're getting in these bad situations where you really have to clean up a lot at the end there. So it's kind of, you'd almost rather have a higher average third down distance because you'd rather not face that many third downs.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do have them in the top 10 for expected conversion rate. So they have a high expectation because, like you mentioned, they've been in these short. So they're by my numbers, they're ninth in expected conversion rate, and then their actual conversion rate, they're 30th. So that shows you how bad they've been.
Yeah, woof. And some of that is, sometimes third down is, positive, negative variance, but some of that is maybe there's a little bit of signal of just being that bad.
Yeah, I think Lawrence might have some. He might, do some things sometimes. I mean, it's kind of like the Josh Allen thing a bit. Where you watch him and you're like, he's going to do some things sometimes. Where, I just think Mahomes is just on this weird level where, you might have a totally random bad play here or there, but he's just so much more reliable for not only the upside plays, but then not having these weird things. Like I just can't imagine a 3-game stretch where Mahomes would underperform on third down to this sort of level. I can't even imagine a 3-game stretch where he would just be at expectation on third down because he's so good in those sorts of situations. So I think that's just really like the differentiating factors in some of these quarterbacks is how reliable they can be in these circumstances.
Absolutely. Kevin, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you stopping by today and just talking about the league and so much good information. People can subscribe to your Substack, Unexpected Points. They can follow you on Twitter. How many underscores is at the end of Twitter?
We're going dealing with 3. It was like more like a placeholder because it used to be PFF there. And then I couldn't do NFL. Sorry. Apologies to anyone out there who has NFL at the end of their handle because I know there are many of them out there. But I couldn't do NFL, so I put the underscores. It's like no one even cares what the handles are. I mean, your stats of war, right? So it's like, do people even remember? I guess it's related to somewhat to your brand, but I don't have it. Yeah, the dreaded triple underscore. Definitely.
Well, you got
NFL.
Got unexpected. Yeah, you've got unexpected points there. You should have done Insider. That's what you should have done. Kevin Cole Insider as the and just show it off.
I'm not a fan of the Insider game, but yeah.
Cool. Well, Kevin, thanks so much. Really appreciate it, man. Go follow Kevin. Go watch and listen to his podcast. Subscribe to his newsletter. Some great stuff in there. Kevin, I'm sure I'll have you back again soon to talk about the league.
All right. Appreciate having me.